Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It is Thursday. We have been talking about the book of Haggai this week, and today there's a supplemental passage from the book of Psalms 51. And this is the psalm David wrote when Nathan confronted him about committing adultery and with Bathsheba. This is his response. And he's writing this to God. In verse 4, he says, "Against you and you alone have I sinned. I have done what is evil in your sight." There's a lot that could be asked about this verse 4. So the question is, do we sin only against God, or do we sin against people? And is there a difference? Because there are other passages that we could go to that would have some nuance to this. But do we sin against only God, or is there a sin against people as well?
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes. I would say, first of all, it is God alone who is holy and righteous, that it's his standard to which we sin against. I would say that to begin with. Do we sin against people in that we harm them, hurt them, offend them? The answer would be yes. But it is ultimately God that we sin against that keeps us from measuring up to his holiness and to his righteousness. Think about it in this regard. If I commit an offense against you, crime, it is the state or the government who, even though I have hurt you, offended you, harmed you, but it is the state or the government for which holds the authority to make the judgment and impose penalties against me. And I see it kind of like that with God. Even though I hurt, harm people, sin against them, if you want to use that term, it is ultimately God whose standard that I have violated that holds the authority and the judgment to pronounce that against me.
I think we often like to convince ourselves that God is the only one that we're sinning against with things that we choose to do and think, oh, it's not really going to affect anybody else. But you'd have a pretty hard time coming up with a sin that is not going to have an effect on somebody else, especially the people closest to you.
I think part of the reason for that, this is my personal take, is I think it's easier for us because God, even though we believe in God, we love God, He's out there, He's abstract. I think it's a lot easier for us to say, God, I'm sorry, I committed this offense. Whereas if it's against the individual and we have to take ownership of that, and often that requires something of us, whether it's, conversation, an apology, restitution, or whatever it may look like. And so therefore that is oftentimes, I believe that's a harder step for us as individuals than it is even to go to God.
Ultimately, it is the relationship with God that matters.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I think the way I would answer this question, because I don't believe you only sin against God.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some other scriptures I could point to that say it a slightly different way. But what I also would say is there is no sin against man that will doom you to hell if God has forgiven you of that sin. The only person that we can sin against that it has eternal consequences is with God, not with people. Now, clearly in this story, and I've adjusted my thoughts about this a little bit.
Mm.
When we were in Israel, he used the word rape.
Yeah.
Where Bathsheba was concerned, our guide did. I'd heard that one other time, and I just discounted it. But, he made the case like she had no choice. Mm-hmm. She was minding her own business. He shouldn't even have been where he was. She was doing what she was supposed to do. He shouldn't have been where he was. And then what do you say when the king invites you? You got to go, She may have wanted it or not wanted to or not wanted to when she got there. We don't have this. The Bible doesn't tell us all those things. But Bathsheba could have been someone he sinned against. He clearly sins against her husband, Uriah. You know, he's taken his wife, then he has him murdered. Like, he clearly has committed an offense against him. It's not repairable though. Like, he can't
bring it back.
He can't fix it. He can't even apologize for it, you know? And so ultimately the person that he has to make it right with is God. And I think I do think it has to begin with God. You know, I think our offense righting mechanism has to start with him. But I do think that it's hard to make the argument here that God was the only one offended in this situation.
You know, I'm reminded even all the way back in the beginning in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned. They sinned against God, but they sinned against each other.
Mm-hmm.
But it was only God for which they hid from. They didn't hide from each other, but it created tension and problems even in that relationship that has continued throughout human history. And so it's twofold in that you said it, that God is ultimately the one in the relationship that matters, and I agree 100%. You know, that's a heaven or hell issue that you need to deal with. The sin against people, particularly unresolved, creates all kind of problems and havoc here on a horizontal level in this life. So
you
both
said
are
something made me want to ask a question.
Uh-oh.
Do you think Adam and Eve had an argument before they ate of the tree?
Before they what?
Ate of the tree.
Oh.
Do you think they were in one mind, one accord? No, all was peaceful.
I tend to think yes, because they had not experienced sin till that point. And so, at least in my mind.
Yes, they had not had an argument.
Correct. That they had not. Mm-hmm. They had experienced bliss and peace. You know, part of the nakedness in there, I'm convinced, goes far beyond physically, but in their relationship, there was nothing hidden in the sense of conversation and honesty and transparency and all those things that God intended for that type relationship between a man and a woman in a marriage covenant to experience, and that when sin entered, that all those things begin to be fractured. And so
Adam and Eve sinned against us.
Sure they did. Yeah. They certainly did. Yeah. Which and when you say it like that and think of it in that context, it's pretty sobering to realize that we sin against other people that may have generational consequences too.
I suspect that there's chance hundreds of years after I'm gone, there will be people dealing with some sin I've committed. Possibility.
Yeah.
At least scripturally, the generational problem.
I would agree with that. Not for you, but I'm saying for me. I mean, let me clarify. I'm talking about for me, my sin, my stupidity. Yes, absolutely. Thank God for forgiveness, and we need to work at trying to make human relationships as best they can be when we do sin.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back tomorrow as we finish up our conversation on the book of Haggai.